July 17, 1969. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean at 37,000 feet. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar cuts through darkness at 580 miles per hour, its 3 Rolls-Royce engines generating enough thrust to keep 183 passengers suspended in a metal tube 7 miles above an ocean that could swallow them without a trace. Inside cabin 14A, a businessman named Robert Mitchell checks his Rolex. 3 hours into the flight from JFK to Paris, he's drinking his second bourbon. The ice cubes clink against crystal glass that costs more than most people's weekly salary. The seat reclines at angles that feel impossible. The legroom is generous enough to stretch fully without touching the seat in front. The stewardess, her uniform tailored to perfection, smiles when she refills his drink without being asked. She remembers his name, remembers he takes it neat. 2 fingers, no ice despite what's currently in his glass. The meal service will begin in 20 minutes. Filet mignon or lobster thermidor, prepared in actual ovens by actual chefs 37,000 feet above the Atlantic, served on china plates with real silverware and linen napkins that smell like lavender and ambition. This is Trans World Airlines at the height of its power. This is what flying used to mean before it became a commodity, before airlines turned passengers into cargo, before the experience degraded into something barely more dignified than riding a bus. This is 1969, and TWA owns the sky. They don't just fly between continents. They define what intercontinental travel means. They set standards that competitors struggle to match. When people think about flying, they think about this: the quiet hum of pressurized air, the gentle vibration of jet engines, the feeling that they're not just traveling, but transcending. That geography is optional, that Paris is closer than Cleveland was to their grandparents. Mitchell doesn't know it yet, but he's experiencing the last golden moments of something that's already dying. Doesn't know that the company flying him across the Atlantic in unprecedented comfort is rotting from the inside, that the beautiful terminal he departed from, that architectural masterpiece that looks like a concrete bird, frozen mid-flight, is already becoming a monument to failure rather than a testament to vision. That within 32 years, TWA will cease to exist. That the airline making him feel like royalty is being systematically destroyed by the very people who claim to be running it. But right now, in this moment, suspended between continents and clouds, none of that matters. Right now, TWA is immortal. The bourbon is excellent. The seat is comfortable. Paris is getting closer by the minute. This is what the future was supposed to look like. This is what we killed. The story of how an airline went from this to extinction doesn't start with bankruptcy or corporate raiders or terrorist attacks. It starts 71 years earlier in Kansas City, with a man staring at a primitive aircraft and seeing not what it was, but what it could become. 1930, Kansas City, Missouri. The air thick with humidity and possibility. Jack Fry stands in a hangar that smells like motor oil and canvas, and the kind of desperation that comes from betting everything on an idea most people think is insane. The Fokker F-10 tri-motor in front of him looks like an insult to physics. 3 engines mounted on struts that shake when they run. A corrugated aluminum fuselage that rattles in moderate turbulence. Wicker seats for 10 passengers bolted to a wooden floor. No heating. No pressurization, no meaningful safety features beyond prayers and hope. The cockpit is open to the elements. Pilots wear leather jackets and goggles not for style but for survival, because at 10,000 feet in winter, the cold can kill you faster than a crash. Commercial aviation in 1930 is barely distinguishing itself from suicide with paperwork. The accident rate is catastrophic. 1 death per million passenger miles sounds acceptable until you calculate that it means flying is 200 times more dangerous than driving, 40 times more dangerous than taking a train. Planes crash into mountains because pilots can't see them through cloud. Crash into storms because weather forecasting is educated guessing at best. Crash because engines fail and there are no backups. And gliding to safety assumes you can find a place to land before gravity wins. Insurance companies charge astronomical premiums because the math is unforgiving and the actuaries aren't stupid. But Fry isn't looking at the mortality statistics. He's looking at the economic equation. New York to Los Angeles by train takes 72 hours, 3 full days of industrial tedium, watching America scroll past at 40 miles per hour, stopping at every significant city and most insignificant towns, eating questionable food prepared in rolling kitchens that smell like onions and regret. An airplane, this ridiculous contraption that most people consider a death trap, can make the same journey in 18 hours, including refueling stops in Columbus and Kansas City and Albuquerque because the fuel capacity is limited and the range is measured in hundreds of miles, not thousands. 18 hours, versus 72 hours. The math isn't subtle. Anyone whose time is valuable enough, whose business is urgent enough, whose opportunity is fleeting enough, will pay whatever it costs to compress 3 days into less than one. The market is small, but the margins are enormous. A train ticket from New York to Los Angeles costs approximately $150. An airline ticket costs $400, nearly 3 times the price for a quarter of the time. That's not transportation. That's time travel. That's turning calendar pages into clock minutes. That's selling something more valuable than comfort or safety or even survival. You're selling time itself. Fry is 26 years old. He's been flying since 19, accumulated thousands of hours barnstorming across the Midwest, survived 3 crashes that should have added his name to the accident statistics. He understands aviation intimately, knows that every flight is negotiating with physics, that every landing is controlled falling, that every takeoff is defying forces that want to keep you on the ground. He also understands something his competitors don't. The airplane isn't competing with trains or cars. It's creating an entirely new category of human experience. It's making possible things that were previously impossible. A businessman can close a deal in Manhattan and sleep in his own bed in Pasadena that night, can attend a funeral in Chicago and be back at his desk in San Francisco the next morning, can chase opportunities that move faster than trains can carry him. This is what Fry is selling. Not transportation, time, freedom from geography, the ability to be in 2 places on the same day when those places are separated by half a continent. The Fokker F-10 is primitive, but it's sufficient. It flies, it carries passengers, it compresses distance into something manageable. That's enough to start. Transcontinental Air Transport was founded in 1928 by a collection of investors who understood the economics, but not the operation. They had Charles Lindbergh's name attached to the venture because Lindbergh had become America's most famous aviator after his solo Atlantic crossing. They thought his celebrity would translate into ticket sales. It didn't. People wanted to hear Lindbergh talk about flying, wanted to see him at air shows and parades. They didn't necessarily want to trust their lives to the same technology that had required enormous courage to use over the Atlantic. Western Air Express operated regional routes throughout California and the Southwest, flying mail contracts and occasional passengers when space allowed. They were profitable but limited, operating in a geographic box that restricted growth. The merger in 1930 created Transcontinental and Western Air. The name was forgettable, but the ambition wasn't. Connect the coasts. Make transcontinental flight routine. Prove that aviation wasn't a novelty or a stunt, but a legitimate business that could generate sustainable revenue. The early years were exercises in controlled chaos. Pilots navigated by following highways and railroad tracks, descending below cloud layers when visibility dropped, sometimes landing in farmers' fields when weather made continuing impossible. Weather forecasts came via telegraph from stations hundreds of miles away, information that was hours old by the time pilots received it. Navigation was compass headings, adjusted for estimated wind speeds that pilots guessed by watching smoke or dust or the direction trees bent. Radio communication was unreliable. Frequencies that faded in and out, static that made voices unintelligible. The aircraft had no pressurization, which meant flights above 10,000 feet required passengers to wear oxygen masks, rubber and canvas contraptions that smelled like chemicals and fear, that fogged up and made breathing feel like work. No de-icing systems meant that flying through clouds in winter was gambling with ice accumulation that changed wing shapes and eventually stopped generating lift. The bathrooms were chemical toilets behind curtains that provided visual privacy but no sound dampening. The noise level inside the cabin was loud enough to make conversation difficult, a constant roar of propellers and wind and the flexing of aluminum under stress. The vibration was relentless, everything shaking and rattling and occasionally making sounds that passengers hoped were normal, but suspected might be preliminary to structural failure. This was commercial aviation in the early 1930s. Uncomfortable, dangerous, expensive, and absolutely revolutionary. Because despite the discomfort and danger, people came. Enough people that TWA could operate scheduled service, could employ pilots and mechanics and administrative staff, could order newer aircraft with better performance, could slowly, painfully, incrementally improve the experience until flying became slightly less terrifying and moderately more comfortable. By 1934, TWA operated a route network connecting 16 cities across 2,300 miles. Newark to Los Angeles with stops in Pittsburgh, Columbus, Indianapolis, St. Louis, Kansas City, Wichita, Amarillo, Albuquerque, Flagstaff, and Kingman. The aircraft improved. Douglas DC-2s replaced the Fokkers. increasing capacity from 10 to 14 passengers, increasing speed from 118 to 190 miles per hour. The construction improved. Monocoque aluminum fuselages instead of corrugated metal, closed cockpits instead of open air, actual seats with cushions instead of wicker. The windows were real glass. The cabin had some insulation against sound and cold. It was still uncomfortable, still loud, still dangerous, but incrementally less so. The company hemorrhaged money. Operating an airline in the 1930s required massive capital investment with minimal return. Aircraft cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, equivalent to millions today. Maintenance was constant and expensive because the technology was primitive and failure rates were high. Fuel costs, labor costs, insurance costs all added up to operating expenses that ticket revenue barely covered. Most flights operated at a loss. The business model was predicated on future profitability, on betting that technology would improve and costs would decrease and demand would increase enough to make the economics work. TWA's investors understood they were building infrastructure for a future that hadn't arrived, that they were establishing routes and building brand recognition and developing operational expertise that would be valuable once aviation matured. They were willing to accept losses in the 1930s to capture profits in the 1940s and beyond. What they needed was someone with deep enough pockets to fund losses indefinitely, someone wealthy enough and obsessed enough to pour millions into an industry that might not generate meaningful returns for a decade or more, someone who treated money like fuel that could be burned to make impossible things happen. They needed Howard Hughes, 1939, Los Angeles, California, the Hollywood producer who had turned inherited wealth into a fortune, who had made films that won Academy Awards, who had set aviation records that made headlines worldwide, acquired a controlling stake in Transcontinental and Western Air for $7,800,000, the equivalent of roughly $150 million today. Hughes didn't buy an airline because he needed transportation. He owned private aircraft that he flew himself, bought it because he was psychologically incapable of encountering mediocrity without intervening, because he looked at the commercial aviation industry and saw inefficiency and wasted potential and opportunities that smaller minds were missing, because he believed that flying could be more than transportation, could be an experience worth paying for, worth remembering, worth choosing over cheaper alternatives. Howard Hughes was 34 years old when he took control of TWA, already wealthy beyond most people's imagination, already famous for his films and his aviation achievements and his relationships with Hollywood's most beautiful actresses, already exhibiting the eccentricities that would eventually metastasize into full-blown mental illness, the obsessive attention to detail, the refusal to delegate, the paranoia about germs that made him refuse to shake hands, refuse to touch doorknobs directly, refuse to eat food prepared by people he didn't trust, the insomnia that kept him awake for days, that made him call executives at 3 a.m. with detailed instructions about minor issues, the conviction that his judgment was superior to everyone else's, that his instincts were infallible, that his vision should override expert opinions. But in 1939, those eccentricities were manageable. They were oddities rather than disabilities. Hughes was still functional, still capable of running multiple businesses simultaneously, still able to channel his obsessions into productive outcomes. He looked at TWA and saw potential that existing management was squandering, saw an opportunity to build something that didn't exist yet, saw a chance to prove that commercial aviation could be luxurious, prestigious, aspirational, that it could compete with ocean liners, not just on speed, but on elegance. That flying could be sold not as utilitarian transportation, but as an experience worth having for its own sake. Hughes poured money into TWA the way other industrialists poured concrete into dams, relentlessly, compulsively, without regard for traditional financial metrics or return on investment timelines. He ordered Lockheed Constellations, those gorgeous triple-tailed aircraft that looked like they belonged in science fiction magazines rather than commercial aviation. The Constellation was revolutionary. 4 18-cylinder radial engines producing 2,400 horsepower each. Pressurized cabin that allowed cruising at altitudes above 20,000 feet, above most weather systems, in smooth air where turbulence was rare, range sufficient to fly coast to coast with a single refueling stop, speed approaching 350 miles per hour, cutting transcontinental flight times nearly in half. But Hughes didn't just want faster aircraft. He wanted better aircraft, wanted every detail perfected. He spent months working with Lockheed engineers, demanding modifications, insisting on improvements, refusing to accept anything less than his vision of what commercial aviation should be. He demanded pressurization systems that could maintain sea-level pressure at cruising altitude, demanded navigation equipment that could operate in all weather conditions, demanded structural redundancy that would keep the aircraft flying even if systems failed, demanded performance specifications that exceeded what Lockheed thought was possible. The interior was where Hughes's obsession with excellence became most visible. Red velvet upholstery on seats that reclined further than any previous commercial aircraft, polished wood trim, brass fixtures, individual reading lights, generous legroom. The cabin was designed not for maximum capacity, but for maximum comfort. 75 passengers instead of the 100 that the fuselage could theoretically accommodate. Space was treated as a luxury item, something worth paying for, something that differentiated TWA from competitors who packed passengers like cargo. The service was equally obsessive. Hughes hired stewardesses based on appearance and trained them like they were joining an elite service organization. The uniforms were designed by Hollywood costume departments, tailored to each individual, elegant without being provocative, professional without being boring. The training covered not just safety procedures, but service protocols, how to serve meals, how to mix drinks, how to handle difficult passengers with grace, how to make everyone feel important even when some passengers were objectively more important than others. The meals were prepared by chefs, actual trained culinary professionals, not cafeteria workers reheating pre-packaged food. The menu changed seasonally. The silverware was real silver. The china was actual china, heavy enough to feel substantial, decorated with TWA's logo. The champagne was French. The beef was prime. The vegetables were fresh, loaded onto aircraft at each stop, prepared in galleys that had actual ovens rather than just warming trays. Eating on a TWA flight in the 1940s was comparable to eating at a good restaurant. Not excellent, not Michelin-starred, but competent and thoughtful, and significantly better than what competitors offered. Hughes understood something about human psychology that his competitors either didn't understand or didn't care about. People don't just buy products. They buy feelings. They buy identities. They buy the opportunity to be the kind of person who flies TWA. The marketing materials emphasized elegance and sophistication and membership in an exclusive club. Print advertisements showed well-dressed passengers sipping cocktails while clouds drifted past windows. The copy emphasized experience over utility, talked about the pleasure of flying rather than just the speed, positioned TWA not as transportation, but as an event worth paying extra for. The strategy worked. By 1945, TWA was generating $43 million in annual revenue, equivalent to roughly $700 million today. By 1950, that figure had grown to $87 million, nearly doubling in 5 years. By 1955, it had reached $126 million, growth that validated Hughes' investment and silenced critics who thought he was wasting money on luxury. The airline operated routes not just domestically, but internationally. New York to Paris, New York to Rome, New York to Cairo, New York to Tel Aviv. The red and white TWA livery became recognizable in airports worldwide. Trans World Airlines, the name officially changed in 1950 to reflect the global ambitions, stood for something more than transcontinental service. It stood for the compression of geography into irrelevance, for the belief that humans weren't meant to be constrained by distance, for the promise that anywhere was reachable if you were willing to pay for speed. The numbers capture part of the story, but miss the essence. Can't convey what it felt like to board a Constellation at Idlewild Airport in 1952, to walk up those stairs and enter a cabin that smelled like leather and perfume and possibility, to find your seat wider and more comfortable than most people's living room furniture, to feel the vibration as 4 massive radial engines coughed to life. That distinctive sound of 18 cylinders per engine firing in sequence, 72 cylinders total, creating a symphony of controlled explosion. To feel the aircraft begin moving, taxiing toward the runway, the anticipation building as speed increased and the ground fell away, and suddenly you were flying, actually flying, 7 miles above the earth in a metal tube that had no business staying aloft, but did anyway because physics and engineering and human ambition made it possible. To look out the window and watch cities become toys, become maps, become abstract patterns of streets and rivers and coastlines. To know that in 14 hours you would be in Paris, that the Atlantic Ocean, which had separated civilizations for millennia, which had required weeks to cross by ship just a century earlier, was now an inconvenience to be crossed while reading the morning newspaper and drinking coffee. The Constellation wasn't just an aircraft, it was a time machine that collapsed distance, that made the world smaller, that turned international travel from adventure into routine. For nearly 2 decades, TWA owned that experience. Competitors tried to match them. Pan Am had Juan Tripi's ruthless expansion strategy. United had operational efficiency. American had competitive pricing, but none of them captured what Hughes created. The feeling that flying TWA meant you were special, that you belonged to an exclusive group, that you had access to experiences ordinary people couldn't afford. That feeling, more than the aircraft or the routes or the service, was TWA's competitive advantage. It's also what eventually killed them when they lost it. The terminal at Idlewild Airport, later renamed Kennedy Airport, was supposed to be TWA's permanent monument. Eero Saarinen, the Finnish-American architect who had already made his reputation designing buildings that rejected modernism's boring boxes, saw the TWA Flight Center as an opportunity to create something unprecedented. A building that captured the essence of flight without being literal. That made people feel like they were already in motion, even while standing still. That treated architecture as sculpture, as expression, as art, rather than just functional space. Saarinen designed 2 massive concrete shells that curved upward and outward like wings frozen mid-flight. Each shell was over 300 feet long, rising 58 feet at the highest point. The concrete was poured in place using custom formwork, creating smooth curves impossible with traditional construction methods. Some engineering consultants declared it unbuildable. Saarinen insisted otherwise. The engineers found solutions. The result was unlike anything else in aviation, in architecture, possibly in the world. The interior eliminated right angles entirely. Walls flowed into ceilings. Ceilings flowed into skylights. Everything curved, everything connected, creating spaces that felt organic rather than construct. Natural light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows and strategically placed skylight, changing throughout the day as the sun moved, making the interior feel alive. The departures board was sculptural rather than utilitarian, floating in space like modern art. The seating areas felt like lounges from luxury hotels, circular pods with low furniture, upholstered in bold colors. Even the ticket counters followed the building's curves, organic forms that looked grown rather than built. Walking through the terminal wasn't just functional, it was experiential. Beautiful, a statement that flying was special, that airports didn't have to be boring, that transportation architecture could aspire to something higher than basic utility. Saarinen died in September 1961, 8 months before the terminal opened. Brain tumor at age 51, his last major work still under construction, his vision incomplete but unstoppable. The terminal opened on May 28, 1962, a monument to his belief that architecture could transcend function and become art. The construction cost $43 million, equivalent to roughly $400 million today. It was audacious, excessive, exactly the kind of investment that rational business analysis would reject. You don't need sculptural concrete shells to board aircraft. You need gates and ticket counters and baggage systems. The TWA Flight Center provided those, but also provided meaning. Inside that terminal, TWA felt immortal, felt like it would last forever, felt like the natural order of things, rather than a temporary arrangement that could be destroyed by bad decisions and worse management. But while Saarinen was designing eternity in concrete, the foundations were already cracking. The disease that would eventually kill TWA was taking root in boardrooms and accounting departments, in the conflicts between Hughes's vision and the financial realities of running an airline, in the fundamental tension between building something magnificent and building something profitable. Hughes was brilliant, but his brilliance was becoming pathological. The eccentricities that had been manageable in 1939 were metastasizing into dysfunction by the late 1950s. The obsessive attention to detail was becoming paralysis, the inability to make decisions without perfect information that never arrived. The insomnia was becoming chronic. Days without sleep that impaired judgment and created erratic behavior. The paranoia about germs was becoming debilitating. Rituals that consumed hours, that made normal business operations impossible. The refusal to delegate was becoming a bottleneck. Every decision requiring Hughes' approval, even as Hughes became increasingly unavailable, increasingly unreachable, increasingly consumed by compulsions he couldn't control. Board meetings became theater of the absurd. Executives presented proposals and waited for responses that sometimes came immediately and sometimes didn't come for weeks. Hughes would call at 3 a.m. with detailed instructions about seat fabrics or meal service or paint schemes. then disappear without addressing strategic issues that required urgent decisions. The company was being run by a ghost who occasionally materialized to micromanage trivia while ignoring existential threats. The jet age arrived, and TWA was late. Boeing had developed the 707, four-engine jet capable of flying coast-to-coast non-stop at speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Pan Am ordered 20 in 1955, United ordered 30, American ordered 30. All immediately, all without hesitation. Hughes studied specifications for months, compared Boeing's 707 with Douglas's DC-8 in exhaustive detail, demanded custom modifications, negotiated for better prices, delayed and delayed and delayed while competitors started flying jets, started flying faster, started offering service that made TWA's constellations look obsolete. By the time TWA finally received its first jets in 1959, the competition had a 2-year head start. 2 years in aviation is an eternity. Long enough for competitors to establish themselves as the modern choice, the innovative choice, the obvious choice for anyone who valued speed and comfort. Long enough for brand perception to shift from TWA is the best to TWA used to be the best. Long enough for market share to erode, for customers to switch loyalties, for competitive advantages to disappear. The 707 changed everything, cut flight times in half, increased capacity to 120 passengers or more, made transatlantic service routine instead of remarkable, made flying so common that the glamour started fading, that the exclusivity started dissolving, that aviation began its inevitable transformation from luxury service to commodity. TWA eventually operated one of the largest 707 fleets in the world, but they were playing catch-up. Reacting instead of leading, following instead of innovating. The company that had once set standards was now scrambling to meet them. The forced removal of Howard Hughes from TWA happened slowly, through legal maneuvers and financial pressure spanning years. The banks that financed TWA's expansion demanded changes. The board demanded changes. Even Hughes's own executives demanded changes. The proximate cause was debt. Hughes had borrowed heavily to finance fleet orders, maintenance facilities, gate leases, operating losses during lean years. Borrowed and borrowed, using TWA's assets as collateral, treating debt like fuel that could keep the company accelerating indefinitely. Debt accumulates. Interest compounds. Eventually, creditors want repayment. When TWA's financial situation deteriorated in the late 1950s, when delayed jet orders meant market share losses, when operating losses mounted into millions, banks got nervous, started demanding accountability Hughes couldn't or wouldn't provide. In 1960, creditors demanded Hughes either inject fresh capital into TWA or relinquish control. Hughes refused both, proposed alternative financing, made promises he couldn't keep, hired lawyers to fight in court. But the math was unforgiving. TWA owed hundreds of millions. Hughes had wealth to cover debts theoretically, but assets were tied up in other companies, in real estate, in investments that couldn't be quickly liquidated. He needed time. Creditors wouldn't wait. December 1960, a court ruled Hughes had to relinquish voting control of TWA. Not sell shares, but transfer voting rights to a trust controlled by creditors. A coup disguised as restructuring. Hughes fought, filed appeals, hired more lawyers, threatened and cajoled and bargained. But he was too far gone, too disconnected from operational realities, too consumed by mental deterioration to mount effective defense. The court's decision became final in 1961. Howard Hughes, who had owned and controlled TWA for 22 years, who had poured his fortune and obsession and brilliance into making it great, was forced out. He retained equity, but had no say in management, a passive investor in a company that had been his life's work. He took it badly, stopped appearing in public entirely, spent remaining years locked in hotel suites, descending into paranoia and addiction and obsessive rituals that consumed him. He lived another 15 years, died in 1976, but the Howard Hughes who built TWA died in 1961 when the court took away his company. With him went something essential, something that couldn't be replaced by competent management or strategic planning or financial discipline. TWA had been Hughes' obsession. It had been personal, art disguised as commerce, passion disguised as business. He made decisions that didn't make financial sense because he believed in vision more than spreadsheets, excellence more than efficiency, building something magnificent more than building something profitable. When he left, what remained was just commerce. Just another airline competing for market share. The new leadership was competent. Ernest Breach, brought in to stabilize the company, had solid background in manufacturing and finance. He streamlined operations, reduced costs, negotiated better supplier deals, implemented modern management practices, did everything by the book. Ran TWA the way business schools taught companies should be run, rationally, efficiently, carefully. In doing so, began killing it. Because TWA wasn't built on rationality, it was built on vision, on belief that an airline could be more than logistics and scheduling, that it could be an experience worth remembering, worth paying extra for, worth choosing when cheaper options existed. When you replace vision with competence, when you replace passion with process, you get something functional but forgettable. An airline that flies planes on time and delivers adequate service and generates acceptable profit margins. Mediocrity wrapped in a brand that once meant excellence. Passengers felt it first. The little things. Meals got simpler, cheaper ingredients, served with less presentation. Uniforms got less elegant, practical instead of glamorous. Service got more perfunctory, efficient instead of attentive. The experience started feeling like work instead of wonder. Slowly, imperceptibly, people started choosing other airlines. Not because TWA was bad, it wasn't. It was perfectly adequate. But adequate doesn't inspire loyalty. Adequate doesn't make customers willing to pay extra, wait longer, choose you when competitors offer essentially the same thing. By late 1960s, TWA was profitable but unremarkable, operated massive route network domestically and internationally, flew hundreds of flights daily, employed thousands of people, generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue, by every conventional metric successful, but had lost something intangible and irreplaceable. Had lost what made it special, had lost its soul. Once you lose that, once your identity becomes we fly planes places, the rest is just mathematics, just market forces and competitive dynamics and economic cycles grinding down whatever remains until nothing is left but balance sheets. The 1970s arrived with turbulence. The oil crisis of 1973 quadrupled fuel prices overnight. Airlines that had been profitable became money pits. Routes that made sense suddenly didn't. The entire economic model of aviation was upended. TWA, like every carrier, scrambled to adapt. They cut routes, cut staff, cut services, cut everything that wasn't essential. The problem was they also cut things that were essential. The intangibles that differentiated them from competition. They treated the airline like a cost-cutting exercise instead of a brand to protect. They optimized for short-term survival at the expense of long-term viability. The fuel crisis wasn't just an economic shock. It was an existential threat to an industry built on cheap energy. Jet fuel that had cost 11 cents per gallon in 1972 jumped to 38 cents by 1974. Operating costs exploded. Airlines that had carefully calibrated their route networks based on fuel economics suddenly found that half their routes were unprofitable. TWA's network was particularly vulnerable because Hughes had prioritized geographic coverage over operational efficiency. They flew to dozens of cities that couldn't support profitable service, even with cheap fuel. With expensive fuel, these routes became anchors, dragging the airline underwater. Management made choices, bad ones. They raised ticket prices to cover fuel costs, which drove price-sensitive customers to competitors. They reduced service frequency on marginal routes, which drove business travelers to competitors who offered more convenient schedule. They deferred aircraft maintenance to preserve cash, which increased mechanical failures and flight delays, which drove everyone to competitors. They were trapped in a doom loop where every cost-cutting measure made the airline less competitive, which reduced revenue, which required more cost-cutting. The Boeing 747 entered service in 1970, and TWA was late adopting it. Again, just like with the 707, they watched competitors fly the jumbo jet for years before committing to orders. When they finally did, they operated them on routes that couldn't support capacity. The 747 was designed for high-volume routes between major hubs. TWA tried using them everywhere, flying half-empty aircraft and hemorrhaging money on every flight. A 747 needs to be at least 60% full just to break even on fuel costs. TWA was averaging 45% load factors on many international routes. Simple arithmetic shows how that ends. The labor situation deteriorated. Pilots went on strike in 1973. Flight attendants went on strike in 1975. Mechanics went on strike in 1977. Not because TWA was uniquely bad, but because the entire airline industry was becoming a battlefield between management trying to cut costs and unions trying to protect jobs and wages. TWA became a case study in how not to handle labor relations. Strikes lasted weeks, sometimes months. Flights got cancelled, passengers got stranded. The brand suffered. Each strike cost tens of millions in lost revenue and damaged the airline's reliability reputation. Business travelers, who represent the most profitable customers, started avoiding TWA because they couldn't risk getting stranded by a strike. The real problem wasn't any single issue. The real problem was TWA had become reactive instead of proactive, constantly responding to crises instead of anticipating them. No coherent strategy, no unifying vision, no clear identity beyond we're an airline that flies places. In a market where every airline flew to roughly the same places at roughly the same prices, that wasn't enough. The terminal at JFK, that beautiful concrete monument to what flying once meant, started showing its age. Not physically, not yet, but conceptually. The curves that looked futuristic in 1962 looked dated in 1978. The interior design that felt cutting-edge felt retro. The building hadn't changed, but the world had. The terminal became a metaphor for TWA itself, beautiful, expensive, increasingly irrelevant. Deregulation came in 1978 and broke whatever remained of the old order. Before deregulation, routes and prices were controlled by the Civil Aeronautics Board. Airlines competed on service, not price. After deregulation, anyone could fly anywhere and charge anything. It was supposed to create competition and lower prices and benefit consumers. It did. It also created a race to the bottom where the only thing that mattered was being cheapest. TWA wasn't built for that world, wasn't built to compete on price, wasn't built to be a discount carrier. It was built to be premium. But premium doesn't work when customers can save $200 flying Southwest or People Express or dozens of new low-cost carriers that sprouted like weeds in deregulation's wake. The airline tried adapting, tried matching competitors' prices while maintaining service level, tried being everything to everyone, premium for business travelers, cheap for leisure travelers, convenient for everyone. It didn't work. Can't be premium and cheap simultaneously. Can't maintain service quality while slashing costs. Can't compete with low-cost carriers using high-cost infrastructure. The losses mounted. Millions became tens of millions, became hundreds of millions. The board panicked, tried different strategies, different leadership, different marketing campaigns. Nothing worked. The airline was bleeding cash, bleeding market share, bleeding relevance. Then, Carl Icahn showed up, 1985. The corporate raider who had made his fortune acquiring companies, stripping them for parts, and selling what remained, had identified TWA as his next target. Icahn didn't want to run an airline. He wanted to extract value from one, wanted to use TWA's assets as collateral for debt, pay himself fees for managing restructuring, and walk away richer, while the company walked into oblivion. But Icahn was smart enough to disguise intentions. He positioned himself as a savior, a turnaround specialist who would rescue TWA from incompetent management and restore it to profitability. He launched a hostile takeover, bought enough shares to control the board, installed himself as chairman. The unions, desperate for someone to blame for declining wages and working conditions, initially supported him, saw him as better than existing management, saw him as someone who might actually fix things. They were catastrophically wrong. Icahn's playbook was elegant in its brutality. He took TWA private, loaded it with debt, used that debt to pay himself special dividends and management fees. He sold off assets. The Heathrow routes went to American Airlines for $445 million. Prime real estate gone. Those London routes represented some of TWA's most profitable operations, the kind of high-yield business travel that every airline coveted. Selling them was like selling the family silver to pay gambling debt. The shuttle service got spun off into a separate company Icahn controlled. More value extracted. He sold aircraft, sold spare parts, sold anything that could be monetized. What did he invest back into the airline? Nothing. TWA's fleet aged. Maintenance got deferred. Service degraded further. The brand that once represented luxury became synonymous with dysfunction. Planes broke down. Flights got delayed. Customer complaints skyrocketed. But Icahn didn't care because he wasn't building a sustainable business. He was harvesting it, extracting every possible dollar before inevitable collapse. The employees suffered most. Icahn demanded wage cuts, benefit reductions, longer hours, fewer staff. He threatened bankruptcy unless unions agreed to concessions. They agreed. Then he came back for more concessions. Then more. each time using the same threat, same playbook, same leverage. Pilots and flight attendants and mechanics who once took pride in working for TWA now dreaded it. Morale collapsed. The best employees left for competitors. The ones who remained were too beaten down or too close to retirement to leave. Passengers noticed. Of course they noticed. You can't run an airline on deferred maintenance and demoralize staff without consequences. On-time performance became a joke, safety record raised concerns, service descended from mediocre to abysmal. TWA became the airline you flew when nothing else was available, the airline you apologized for flying, the airline you complained about at parties. Still, Icahn extracted, still walked away with millions while the company bled. In 1988, TWA filed for bankruptcy. Not because the aviation market collapsed, because Icahn had deliberately over-leveraged the company to maximize personal returns. Treated TWA like a piggy bank, and now the bank was empty. The bankruptcy restructured debt gave TWA a chance to survive. But the damage was done. Brand was poisoned. Infrastructure was degraded. Competitive position was hopeless. Emerging from bankruptcy didn't fix those problems, just delayed the inevitable. Icahn finally relinquished control in 1993. Forced out by creditors who realized he was the problem, not the solution. He walked away with an estimated $500 million in profits over 8 years. $500 million extracted from an airline that was worth less when he left than when he arrived. That's not turnaround expertise. That's asset stripping disguised as management. The 1990s should have been TWA's comeback. New leadership, new strategy, new hope. They tried rebuilding, ordered new aircraft, improved service, invested in technology. Did all the things experts said they should do. For a moment, it looked like it might work. But you can't rebuild a cathedral after someone stole the foundation stones. TWA was operating with ancient aircraft held together by duct tape and prayers, with a route network that made no sense, legacy of decades of bad decisions and asset sales. With employees beaten down so thoroughly, they no longer believed in the mission. With a brand so damaged, customers actively avoided it. The numbers were brutal. In 1995, TWA lost $127 million. In 1996, they lost another $80 million. In 1997, they finally turned a small profit, $38 million. It felt like victory. It was a mirage. That profit came from cost-cutting, not revenue growth, from doing less with less, not creating value, from surviving, not thriving. The fleet was old enough that maintenance costs were eating whatever margins existed. The DC-9s that formed the backbone of domestic operations were 30 years old, burning fuel inefficiently, breaking down constantly, requiring parts that were increasingly difficult to source. The 747s flying international routes were nearly as old, competing against newer aircraft from competitors that were faster and more fuel-efficient, and actually had working entertainment system. The crash of Flight 800 in July 1996 shattered whatever momentum they had built. A 747 exploded over the Atlantic shortly after takeoff from JFK, killing all 230 people aboard. The investigation took years. The cause was eventually determined to be a fuel tank explosion, likely triggered by faulty wiring, but damage to TWA's reputation was immediate and permanent. Fair or not, people associated the airline with disaster. Bookings plummeted. The airline lost an estimated $300 million in the year following the crash. Corporate travel managers stopped booking TWA. Travel agents stopped recommending TWA. Passengers chose other airlines even when TWA offered lower fares because some things matter more than money, and not dying in a fireball over the Atlantic is one of them. They recovered, barely. Limped into the late 1990s operating on fumes, literally and metaphorically. Fleet was old, finances were fragile, competitive environment was merciless, low-cost carriers were devouring market share. JetBlue launched in 2000 with new aircraft and low fares and better service than legacy carriers offered. Southwest was expanding beyond its regional base, flying routes that TWA had once dominated. Legacy carriers like United and Delta and American were forming alliances, creating global networks that dwarfed anything TWA could match. Star Alliance, SkyTeam, oneworld, these partnerships offered seamless connections and reciprocal frequent flyer benefits and coordinated schedules that made international travel easier. TWA wasn't part of any alliance. They were too small to be attractive partners, too damaged to be worth the investment, too close to failure to be worth saving. The airline was being squeezed from above and below, trapped in a middle ground where they were too expensive to compete with budget carriers and too cheap to compete with premium carriers. The business model that had worked for decades that had carried them through previous crises, no longer functioned in an environment where customers had unlimited choices and zero loyalty. The terminal at JFK was still there, but now it was just a sad reminder. The concrete shells were cracking. The interior had been updated with cheap renovations that destroyed the original design's coherence. The furniture was mismatched. The departures board was outdated. The windows needed cleaning. Walking through the terminal in 1999 felt like visiting a museum of failure, a monument to what happens when vision gets replaced by extraction, when long-term thinking gets replaced by quarterly earning, when building something meaningful gets replaced by taking what you can and running. TWA announced in January 2001 they were being acquired by American Airlines. Not a merger, an acquisition. TWA would cease to exist, its routes would be absorbed, its aircraft would be repainted or scrapped, its employees would be fired or reassimilated at lower wages with fewer benefits and less seniority. Its brand would disappear. 76 years of history reduced to a footnote in Americans' corporate presentation, a line item in the quarterly earnings report, a tax write-off worth more dead than alive. The deal closed on December 1st, 2001. The final TWA flight departed from Kansas City, Missouri, the city where it all started 71 years earlier. Flight 220, a 757 carrying a handful of passengers and a plane load of ghosts. The pilots who flew constellations across oceans when doing so required courage as much as skill. The flight attendants who served champagne in crystal glasses at 37,000 feet and made it look effortless. The mechanics who kept impossible machines flying through ingenuity and dedication and sheer stubborn refusal to let metal and physics defeat them. The dreamers who believed an airline could be more than transportation, could be an experience worth having, could be a statement about human ambition and what we're capable of when we refuse to accept limitations. When that aircraft touched down in St. Louis, TWA stopped existing. The logo disappeared from tail fins. The reservation system was absorbed. The phone number was disconnected. The website redirected to Americans' homepage. 71 years of history, of innovation, of actually making the world smaller and more accessible and more connected, reduced to digital artifacts and fading memories, and a hotel built inside a concrete shell that once meant something. What killed Trans World Airlines? The easy answer is Carl Icahn, the corporate raider who treated a company like a personal ATM and walked away rich while everyone else paid the price. There's truth in that answer. Icahn accelerated decline, made recovery impossible, extracted value that could have been invested in survival. But blaming Icahn alone is too simple, too convenient, too focused on one villain when the real story is more complex and more damning. TWA was dying before Icahn arrived, was dying from 1,000 small cuts inflicted over decades, from Hughes' refusal to delegate, his descent into mental illness that paralyzed decision-making at critical moments, from the board's inability to articulate coherent vision after Hughes left, their choice to prioritize financial stability over competitive differentiation, from management's failure to adapt to deregulation, their attempt to compete on price using a cost structure designed for premium service, from the decision to order the wrong aircraft at the wrong time, to fly them on the wrong routes, to defer maintenance until safety became questionable, from labor relations that devolved into open warfare, where strikes became routine and trust became impossible, from a brand that went from aspirational to adequate to actively avoided. TWA died because American capitalism has a fundamental flaw. It rewards extraction over creation, short-term gains over long-term value, financial engineering over actual engineering. It died because Wall Street treats companies like poker chips, assets to be leveraged and monetized and discarded when they stop generating acceptable return. It died because somewhere along the way, we forgot that businesses aren't just machines for generating shareholder returns. They're collections of people building something larger than themselves, creating value that transcends quarterly earnings, serving purposes that can't be captured on balance sheets. Hughes understood that. For all his flaws, all his madness, all his dysfunction, he understood TWA wasn't just an airline. It was a statement about what humanity could achieve when we refused to accept limitation, when we looked at the sky and saw not a barrier, but an invitation, when we treated distance as a problem to be solved rather than a constraint to be accepted, when we believed that the future could be better than the past if we were willing to invest in making it so. When that understanding died, when TWA became just another line item on a balance sheet, just another target for acquisition and cost-cutting and optimization, the airline died with it. The TWA Flight Center still stands at JFK. After TWA collapsed, it sat unused for years. Too expensive to maintain, too historically significant to demolish. a concrete ghost haunting the airport, reminding everyone of what we lost. In 2019, it reopened as a hotel, the TWA Hotel. They restored Saarinen's original design, preserved the curves and the light and the beauty. You can stay there now, can sleep in a room overlooking the runways, can have a drink in the lounge where passengers once waited for flights to Paris and Rome and Cairo, can walk through those magnificent spaces and feel the echo of something that no longer exists. It's beautiful. It's well done. It's also profoundly sad, because it's no longer what it was. No longer a place where the future was taking off every hour, no longer the gateway to everywhere. It's been preserved, but preservation isn't resurrection. It's a memorial, a reminder that once, briefly, magnificently, an airline named TWA made flying feel like magic, made it feel like humans were meant for more than being bound to one place, made it feel like the world was ours to explore, ours to connect, ours to shrink down into something manageable. Then we killed it. Not through neglect or accident or bad luck, through choice, through deliberate decisions of men who valued extraction over creation, who confused profit with purpose, who treated an airline like a commodity instead of a cathedral. The hotel is lovely. The terminal is preserved. But TWA is gone, and we're all flying through its empty sky in aircraft that are faster and cheaper and more efficient and utterly forgettable, wondering why flying doesn't feel special anymore, why airports feel like transit hubs instead of gateways to adventure, why we traded magic for cost per seat mile. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. If you want to understand how we build things and then destroy them, how we create beauty and then commodify it, how we take institutions that meant something and reduce them to balance sheets and bankruptcy filings. This is what happens when short-term thinking meets long-term consequences, when financial engineering replaces actual engineering, when we forget that some things are worth more than their liquidation value. The next autopsy is already waiting.